Well, if you think about archaeologists, you probably think about Indiana Jones, right? Or the Tomb Raider, right? People doing these really strange things. Well, they aren't like Indiana Jones. They're like hardworking people that have to be experts, that go to school for a long time, and they get their PhDs, and they learn how to find what was there before we got here. Rochelle Lurie has a doctorate from Northwestern. She's worked on a lot of very interesting places around Illinois. She's won all kinds of awards. She has a site up in, what is that, in Winnebago County, the Mactown site, which is it was a pioneer village, and when they took it apart, they found that people had been there for a long time. She also worked on, the Joliet Arsenal site. There's some stuff there. I don't think she'll get into it, but indicating that people have been there for like 10,000 years ago. Well, anyhow, the past is really exciting, and the only way we know about it is from archaeologists like Rochelle Lurie. Welcome her.
The mic is on. Everyone can hear me? I'm very pleased to be here to schlep along with all of you. You may or may not know, but archaeologists are very hard on their joints. So I have a new knee, I have 2 new hips, and plenty of arthritis to go along with it, so schlepping is what I do a lot. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a site that I worked on in 1993 and 1994. A very, very rich and very important site right outside the town of New Lenox, hence calling it the New Lenox site. And it has taken from 94 to 20 years for us finally to get most of the material that we excavated, analyzed, and ready for publication. This was a project that was done for the New Lenox Park District. They didn't realize they would have such an important and such a large site to deal with because they wanted to build a golf course. And through the analysis phase of this project, we ran out of money. The Park District didn't want to pay any more money, so it has taken 20 years of volunteer labor by lots of very dedicated archaeologists to actually put all of this information together. So let me first start with telling you a little bit about how the site was discovered. The New Lenox Park District owned land to the east side of the railroad tracks that you see there. And they were going to build a retention pond there. And archaeologists from the University of Illinois came up to survey the area that they were going to make into a retention pond. And while they were out there, they also found some artifacts in that little gray area, and they registered it as a site. And the site number is 11WI 213. 11 stands for the state of Illinois, which is the 11th state alphabetically in the Union. A WI stands for Will County, and it was the 213th site that was recorded in that county. Now there are well over 4,000 sites that have been recorded in Will County. So this was one of the early ones. I have one. Oh, okay, that little gray area right in there. Then a collector, a local person who was interested in Indian artifacts went on public land, which is a no-no, and collected artifacts from an area just about in there. And fortunately, this collector actually reported the things that he found to Mr. Ed Lace, who was a naturalist with the Cook County Forest Preserve, and Mr. Lace recorded that collection of artifacts, and it was also given the number 213 because they thought there was probably a connection between that earlier find and the one with the collector. Now, these are some of the things that the collector picked up, and that's only a small portion. So you can imagine that must have been a very rich area to collect on, because we have projectile points, we have scrapers, projectile points from all time periods, beginning from about 10,000 years ago up until 500 years ago. But the problem with collectors is they don't tell you exactly where they found things. So this was sort of the general vicinity. Now, why would this have been a good place for people to live? This is the General Land Office map made in the 1830s to grid off the land so it could be sold to pioneers coming into the area. Now, this little squiggly line here is Hickory Creek. Along Hickory Creek, between this green line and Hickory Creek, was woodlands, okay? And then to the south of the woodlands, you had prairie. At the border between prairie and timber was the best place for finding animals like white-tailed deer, which was a very, very important source of food for the Native Americans in this area. You would have had fish from Hickory Creek, shellfish from Hickory Creek, and all of the animals that would come to Hickory Creek for water. So you would have beavers, you would have woodchucks, you would have all sorts of reptiles and turtles. So this would have been a very, very good place for making a living. Also, the land right down along Hickory Creek was flooded every year. It would have been easily tilled by Native Americans who didn't have steel plows. They could actually till the ground with digging sticks or with hoes made out of bone. So this would have been a really, really good place to make a living. And then, of course, Hickory Creek, as we will see later, is a very important transportation route as well. So a very good place to make a living. In 1993, the new Lenox Park District decided they wanted to build a golf course in between the railroad tracks and Hickory Creek. Now, we have laws in the state of Illinois which require people who are going to modify the landscape to actually do archaeological surveys if there is a known archaeological site on the property. Well, we had that a collector's site right in the middle of where they wanted to build the golf course. So my company was hired. The company is called Midwest Archaeological Research Services, or MARS for short, which makes me a Martian. We were hired to go out and to survey this land. And how do you survey it? Well, this land was all agricultural at the time that we were to survey it. And what archaeologists do is we walk the entire property, that whole area between the railroad tracks and the river, at 10-meter intervals. That's about every 30 feet. We just line up people and we walk across that whole area. And anytime we find an artifact of any sort, we put a pink flag in it. So you can see all the little pink flags in here, and this is the railroad track right back here. Lots of flags over the entire area. Okay. So in fact, what we found there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this big site, 7 sites out there. Some of the sites go back 10,000 years, but the one that I'm going to talk about today, this New Lenox site, dates from beginning around 1000 until the middle of the 1600s. This is a site that spans the time when Native Americans were here and there were no Europeans whatsoever at all. The time when we begin to get trade goods coming into the area, but still no Europeans coming in, okay? So this time period we call the proto-historic, the time when you begin to get European trade goods, but you don't have good written records, and you don't actually have people coming in. And then, as we will hear later, it's possible that this site goes into the actual historic time period with Frenchmen here as well. So it's a very important site because there are very few that document that time period when Europeans were just coming in to the area. Okay, we found lots of things on the surface. Well, what makes a site important? How did we know that this was an important site, a site that we wanted to actually talk about possibly preserving or at least mitigating damage to the site caused by the golf course? Well, what makes a site important is if something is preserved below the plow zone. Everything in that first 12 inches or so has all been churned up by the plow. That means that things like plant remains, animal remains, don't get preserved. And also, if you have a site that has prehistoric pottery on it, that pottery gets broken up into little tiny pieces, and you really have a hard time even seeing it. Okay, so what we do is we test the site. Now, you think archaeologists always work with little dental picks and little trowels. Well, sometimes we also use backhoes. They're a little bit larger. But how do you actually see if there's something below the plow zone? Well, you have to strip that plow zone off. And if you were to do it by hand, it would take you forever. So a backhoe came in and took the plow zone off of 3 different areas in this whole big site that we were working on. And what did we find? Okay. Now, most of you have done some gardening in this area. And you know that once you get down below about a foot of nice dark soil, you get into a clayey or sandy subsoil that's kind of yellowish in color, kind of like this. Now, if anyone has dug a hole into that yellow material and then filled it up at a later time, it's going to have a different texture and a different color than the surrounding soil. And that's what we see here. Native Americans dug a pit into that subsoil all the way down into glacial till. Very rocky, nasty stuff to have to dig, especially if you don't have a shovel, okay? And when they left the area or that pit was no longer useful for its original purpose, which was probably for storing grain or some other type of commodity, they would fill it in with whatever they had left behind, what their garbage was. So these ended up as garbage pits, but when you strip off that plow zone, they become very, very evident. So we had, in the areas that we worked at New Lenox, over 300 of these pits of various sorts, several structures, which you will see in a short while. A very, very rich site. Okay, and this is what these pits look like when you begin to excavate them. We take out one half first to see if there is any layering in the pit. And if there is, then we excavate each layer separately. So this one is about halfway down. You can see there's bone in here, large pieces of prehistoric pottery, and then a lot of pieces of this glacial till that got dug up when they were digging the pit originally and then put back in when it was filled up. This was a very deep storage pit. This is a much shallower hearth and probably a processing pit for various kinds of food. And here again, another fire pit. You can see this orange line around the bottom. That's the burned soil. Okay, so lots of different kinds of what archaeologists call features in the ground. And this is what they looked like schematically. Some of them were very deep, going up to 6 feet deep. Others were shallow. Some had various lenses in them, and some were fairly homogeneous. But all of these different types were present across the entire site, as we were to later find out. Okay, so this shows the area to the west and the middle where the backhoe came in, stripped off the soil, and all the little black dots there are features. And all the little ones that are showing up as gray are post holes. Now those post holes could be parts of structures, they could be wind screens, all sorts of different things. But you can see that there's quite a bit of activity going on in these areas. And then when we get to the east side, we have a lot of features in here. You can't see it very well here, but there is a longhouse. I'll have better photographs of that later. A partial longhouse in here. Lots of features that show up as gray because we actually never did excavate them, and I'll tell you why. And then in the middle, there's this big empty space. Now, when we first had the backhoe come out here, I had been doing archaeology in northern Illinois for 25 years before we worked on this site. We never, even though we often find a lot of things on the surface, once you get the backhoe out there to strip it off, there's almost never anything preserved below the plow zone. Very, very seldom. But there was so much stuff on the surface of this site that I said, oh, there has to be something here. Well, the backhoe started working in this area here, and he worked all day long. Backhoe operators stopped working at about 2:30. It was about 2:15, and he hadn't found a single thing. And I thought, oh, well, that's it. 15 minutes before he was ready to stop, we found our first features back in here. And then there were more, and there were more. And over the next week and a half of working with the backhoe, we found many, many more of these features. Now, this empty area is interesting because why is it empty? Well, one possibility is that it was kind of a plaza in between where there were houses and other features, and this empty area was just a place where people came out and did various activities. They may have been ritual activities, but it's an empty space. Okay. This is the outline of an Oneota house. Each flag in there marks the position of a sapling that was put into the ground. And here I have my cheat notes here. This structure is about 40 feet long and 12 feet wide, and it had a series of hearths in the center and another feature of some pit, a pit of some sort over here. We weren't always working in the best of conditions. It was very wet, very rainy. We covered up those features. But this is the only whole house of this sort, which probably dates from about 1630 AD, that has been found anywhere in the Chicago area. Over in here, we found a burial feature. We were suspicious that this was a burial feature because unlike all the other dark spots that we found in the ground that were round in plan view, this one was oval. So instead of dividing it in half, we took it down about 6 inches at a time, 10 centimeters at a time. And at the top, in this burial pit, which is only about 4.5 feet long, so anyone who was put in there either had to be a child or had to be buried in a sitting position, all right? Now, if you're going to be digging a burial pit into glacial till, you're probably not going to want to make it too terribly large because that's a lot of work. Up at the top on the surface, we found lots of stone tools and the chips from making stone tools. And we found lots of deer antler, okay, very unusual to find at the top of a pit. And then right here on a little shelf was this bear skull. Again, very, very unusual, and probably marked this as a grave of an important person. And we thought, hey, we've got a chief here. And so we started to excavate. And the main burial, the last burial that was put in to this pit is actually, you can see, kind of scrunched up in a sitting position. Turned out to be an old woman. So maybe we're dealing with people who had female chiefs, which is quite possible. Underneath the woman's knees were the gathered remains of a young female. This is a person who died. She was kept somewhere. The flesh came off. They gathered up all the bones and put them down in that pit. And below that was a juvenile. We don't know the age for sure, but probably around 5 or 6 years old, and we couldn't tell the sex, all in that one pit. And they would have been put in the reverse order. The child at the bottom, the disarticulated remains, and then the woman. And probably over that feature, they built a small wooden house or lean-to that would have protected the bones and allowed the pit to fill in naturally. And we know that there are many Algonquian peoples, like the Illinois, like the Miami, who have such a practice. And when this was filled in, it was filled in with all the surrounding soil and very interesting artifacts in there. We'll talk about that in a short while. Okay, so these are the areas that were stripped. And now the Park District has to decide where they're going to put the road going into their golf course and where they're going to put their clubhouse and parking lot. And since this access road here is the only road that goes across the railroad track, this was the obvious place for them to come in, then build a road going back to this large area here that they were going to use primarily as a place for their clubhouse and the parking lot. Okay. Now, any area that was not going to be disturbed by putting in this road or putting in the parking lot and clubhouse is protected now and has not been excavated. So over here, aside from this area here, all the rest of this, including that longhouse, is preserved. We covered it up with black plastic, put dirt over the top. It is now covered in prairie grass. So a lot of the site is still there. This area in here was not going to be affected at all by the golf course. It also has been preserved. Every pit that was found in there that was discovered below the plow zone has been covered up, planted in prairie grass. But look at all of this and look at it here. That's a lot of area. And in order for the Park District to build its golf course there, they had to have archaeologists come in, take the topsoil off of all of that area, and excavate anything that was found there. That's called mitigation. It means that even though there was an important site there, we've got all the information out of it. Now it's all gone. You can build what you want in that area. Okay, this is looking at that west section. Okay, this section in here and part of the road. And you can see that there are all sorts of pits in here that needed to be excavated. The earliest group of features that we found date from the late woodland time period. That would be about 1000 AD. And the cluster was very, very well defined. These gray areas in here are pits also, but they were never excavated because the Park District figured out they could avoid them. So we only excavated those pits that couldn't be avoided. Down here, we have the outlines of a structure from what we call the Langford period. That's about AD 1200 to 1300. And then here, this very large enclosure that we don't have a really good date for, but might possibly be historic. So we'll go through some of these. Okay. This is a map of that late woodland cluster, and you can see that these features are all very close together. We excavated about half of them, but they were almost all empty. There was very little material in them, hardly enough charcoal in any of them to get a radiocarbon date. Very little in the way of ceramics, very little in the way of stone tools. And they were a different shape than most of the other features that we excavated. Instead of being either cylindrical or just shallow pits, kind of basin-shaped, or expanding at the bottom, these were kind of conical in cross-section. So other than telling you that late woodland people were here, I can't tell you exactly what they were doing here or where they may actually have had their houses. Okay, so all of this area out here is outside the area that was stripped. It's possible that late woodland village with some types of housing or something like that actually is in the area here that again is covered in prairie grass and preserved. Okay. This is a Native American house. It was semi-subterranean. It was dug about 1.5 feet into the ground, and all of these are posts that were dug in the ground. There was a central hearth, and then another hearth feature near what we think was the entrance. This structure had been burned. All of this dark colored soil here is pretty much charcoal. But aside from the charcoal, there were very few artifacts found there, which lead us to believe that this was not burned in haste, that whoever was living there was able to take out all of his or her belongings, and then it was burned down either by those people or people coming later on who wanted to clear the area. This entire structure was excavated in 1 meter by 1 meter chunks, and it took a very long time. But as you can see, it didn't go down too far deep into the ground. This feature was approximately 20 feet long, 15 feet wide. So a pretty good sized structure. But then we come to this one, okay? And we call this an enclosure because aside from there being small post holes inside, there were no other pit features of any sort and very few artifacts. Each of the flags in here represents a post that has been dug into the ground, okay? And these posts were dug in really deep into the ground, some of them about 3 feet. Now that's really pretty deep. If you're going to build something like the longhouse and you're using saplings, you don't have to go down very far at all to put the saplings in there, then fold them over and tie them down in some way. But these were very substantial pits for very large pieces of timber. And there are no other structures of this sort in northern Illinois that we know about to date. Now, one of your august members, John Swenson, thinks that this is French in origin. It may very well be. Unfortunately, we don't have very good archaeological evidence because there's very little in the way of trade goods here, and all the radiocarbon dates that we have from this area are too young to be historic. But the construction of this building, or this enclosure, it has a double wall on 2 sides. It may very well have been for protection against enemies of some sort. It may not have been used all the time, but used in emergencies, so that there just wasn't a whole lot of material that was in there. At this point, we are looking for analogs for other structures of this sort that have been found primarily further to the east, where the French were established, to see if we can find similar kinds of structures so that at least the outline and the structure of this is something that we can tie to the French. Okay, so more features in here and in here, and I should point out that this cluster of features in here had a lot of the trade goods, European trade goods that came into the area. And you can see all the area that's never been stripped, where there are probably lots more of these features. So a lot of the site, as I've said before, is preserved. We have a lot of radiocarbon dates for the site, and we can sort of break up the occupation of the site into 4 periods. The late woodland period, the time period when Langford people were living here, and we define these Langford people primarily on their ceramics, and I'll show you some slides in a minute. We have Huber people, again, defined by the kinds of ceramics that they made. And then a new type of ceramic that we named defriant because it sounded sort of French, and because we had a volunteer come out to work with us. His name was Dave Friant. He had brain cancer, but he thought that archaeology was just super wonderful. And he came out and he worked with us as long as he possibly could until we finished all the excavations. He unfortunately died several years ago, but his name lives on in a new ceramic type that will probably be used by archaeologists for years to come. Okay, this is Langford ceramics. The paste, the body of the ceramics, has grit tempering in it to keep the vessel from exploding when it's fired. And these are simple kind of jar shapes with plain rims. Sometimes they will have handles, and they are decorated sometimes with big indentations, probably made by someone's thumb. But the defining characteristic is that grit tempering. Okay. This is Huber ceramics. Unlike the Langford ceramics, Huber people made pottery that was tempered with shell, burned shell. It did the same sort of thing that the black grit that was used in Langford pottery did. It kept the pottery from exploding when it was fired. And they very often had these kind of pie crust rims, but not always, lug handles, and they were decorated with trailed lines, as you can see here. So these were made by Native Americans probably for the most part before trade goods came into the area. But some pits that we have found that have only this kind of ceramic in it also have some trade goods, which leads us to believe that maybe these trade goods got in here earlier than we thought originally. Okay, now, this is a technological glitch. I was going to show you defriant ceramics here, which are very much like the Langford, only they differ in several ways. But this PowerPoint was put together on a Mac, and when you transfer it to a PC, sometimes things get lost. But the main thing is that the defriant ceramics are cord marked, and cord marked in a crisscross manner, which you do not see on the Huber pots. In addition, right where the neck meets the shoulder of the pot, there are indentations, sometimes made with fingernails, sometimes made with an implement of some sort, but very, very different from what these Huber pottery is like. So we think people, probably from the east, were moving into the New Lenox area, bringing their own pottery technology and decorations with them, and kind of incorporating those features that they thought were most important into the kinds of pottery that was already made on the site. So we have either new people coming in fairly goodly numbers, or perhaps we have women moving into this area, perhaps marrying into the Huber people and bringing their pottery technology with them. We don't know that for sure. Okay. A lot of what we found are stone tools. We find stone tools all the time because they preserve. You don't have problems with them disintegrating in various different kinds of soils, but these are some of the items that we recovered. Some of them obviously date to way before the late woodland time period. For example, this artifact here is probably a good 8,000 years old. This one here could be late woodland in date, about 1,000 years, but many of these others really go back thousands of years before that. Now, people collect artifacts today from the surface of the ground because they think they're really neat. I'm sure that Native Americans, if they found stone tools that were made 1,000 years before but were still useful, or they could shape in a way to make them useful, why not? Okay? These stone tools are made out of a material called chert. Chert and flint are the same kinds of material. So if you hear the term flint tools or something like that, in our area, we call it chert because of the way it formed geologically. We don't have lots of good chert sources in northern Illinois because the chert is formed in bedrock, and bedrock is 200 feet below the ground surface. It erodes out of creeks that have been cutting down into that 200 feet, and we have glacial till that has been brought down by the glaciers, okay, before there were any people living here. But this is really considered a chert poor area. So if you find a piece of chert, even if it's already been shaped, but it's useful, you're going to pick it up and you're going to use it again. So it's not really surprising to find that there are some pieces like this in a site as recent as ours. Now, these small triangular points are very typical of the late woodland time period and also of the proto-historic and into the historic period until traders began bringing in metal points. Native Americans kept using their stone arrow points or dart points. We also found a lot of scrapers. One of the important activities that women would have to do would be to scrape hides for preparing clothing. And this was a very arduous task. And so we find a lot of scrapers that would have been used to scrape the fat off of the inside of the hide before tanning. These 5 scrapers were all found in a very small area within a pit. And we think they were probably in some type of bag and lost or for some reason left behind in one of these pits. And the interesting thing about them is they're made out of a chert that comes from along the Illinois River Valley, probably out toward the Mississippi. So not something that we would find in our area typically, and probably either traded in or perhaps brought in because we think that these people had a village at New Lenox, but probably hunted buffalo further out west. And while they were out west hunting buffalo, and if they found chert sources out there, they would have collected some to use for making their own stone tools. Sometimes they didn't use chert, but they used granitic rocks or basalt, whatever they could find that was left by the glaciers. And we can tell from the pitting on these stones on the surface and on the ends that this was kind of like the Swiss Army rock. It was used for everything. It was used for pounding plants. It was used as an anvil for breaking up stone. Could have been used for grinding paints, although we don't have remnants of pigment on them. So could have been used for a lot of different purposes. And some more of them, including a whetstone. You can see the lines here indicating where the tool was sharpened. and abraders made out of sandstone, manos, and a metate, very large rock. Now, I have to digress a little bit, and I see I'm staying on time. When we excavated during phase 2, and I told you how we had not found any pits in that empty area, and then we found 2 right at the end of the day. Well, one of those pits contained brass scraps, and even more importantly, a bead. Now, most of the time when archaeologists excavate, they screen all of the soil that they excavate through 1/4 inch hardware cloth. Now, anything smaller than that goes right through the sieve and gets mixed in with the dirt, okay? So to get a good sample of what smaller items are, we take something called flotation samples, and we process them differently so that any organic material that's lighter than water kind of floats to the top and we can collect it, and anything heavier is collected in window screen size mesh. The only way we were able to find that bead was to use that window screen size mesh in our flotation samples. What this told us was that when we came back to do our mitigation excavations, we had to use a better sampling strategy. So what we did was what we call water screen. We set up screens with variable size mesh in there, going down to window screen size. And instead of dry screening, just taking the dirt out of the pit and putting it through a screen like we have here, set up here, we actually were able to tap into a little pond that was on the golf course property, pipe the water up through these pipes at the top of the screen, and then we took half of every feature that we excavated, hauled it up in trucks, in buckets, and put it through the screen with water, so that everything larger than window screen was collected. Now, since this was all dug into glacial till, you might have a good idea of how much gravel was collected. Lots of it. And in order to find the 32 beads that we have from this site, which is more beads than have been found at any other site in northeastern Illinois, until you get down on the Illinois River to the grand village of the Kaskaskia, we had to go through all that gravel. It took 4 years of volunteer labor by avocational archaeologists to pick through all of that gravel. 4 years. And the results were a handful of beads and metal. Again, I have one missing photograph here that should be a small piece of a brass kettle. Now, when the Native Americans got trade goods in this area in the beginning, they didn't get whole things. They get scraps that were probably traded in by other Native Americans who lived closer to the French or who had more direct connections with the French. And as the artifacts got traded from east further to west, maybe several stops along the way, the pieces got smaller and smaller. The largest piece we have is part of a kettle. We know that because it's filled with rivets of where the kettle was repaired. So by the time it made its way to New Lenox, it was in very, very bad condition. And most of the brass artifacts that we have are either scraps in the process of being made into finished tools or finished ornaments like these here, and these very, very tiny clips that were probably used to decorate clothing. Now, just take a look at how tiny these things are. This is a centimeter. So they're really, really small. And the only way we could find them was to water screen. Now, in addition to these artifacts, we also have some iron. The most exciting, perhaps, or the most identifiable is this hand axe, axe. And this is what it looked like when it came out of the ground. And this is after it was processed to remove all of the rust. And then we have these little bits and pieces of things that are so rusted that if you tried to take the rust off of it, they would completely disintegrate. But there is this one flat piece that might have been part of a knife, and these other little scraps that we really don't know what they were. We don't know if they were things that the local farmer brought in by mistake, or whether they are actually trade goods coming in. This is an example of our 32 beads. These have been analyzed by Mr. William Billick, who is at the Smithsonian Institute. And since we had no money, this is all labor of love by researchers. These beads date our New Lenox period, the proto-historic period at the site, to between 1600 and 1620. Very characteristic of the kinds of beads that you get in that time period further to the east. In addition to all of those artifacts, we also found copious amounts of charcoal. We have only been able to analyze a sample. We now have a graduate student from the University of North Carolina who is going to be coming and taking some of the materials that we could not actually process. I back up. It's all been processed but hasn't been analyzed, and she's going to be using it for her dissertation, trying to talk more about the kinds of plants that were used in this area. But we know for sure that Native Americans had corn, squash, beans, and probably also harvested native grain plants as well. We have animal objects here that these, and again, I have a slide missing, a photograph missing, but these are parts of bison scapula hose, okay? So they would take these bison scapulae that were nice and wide and flat, attach them to a handle, and that's what they would use for planting, okay? We also have deer antler that have cut marks on them. And deer antler were used to make tools for making stone tools, and they were also used to make game counters and other various small objects. But these are the kinds of local animals that we actually have remains of. White-tailed deer being the most important, fish and shellfish coming out of Hickory Creek, turtles, we have some fox and some lynx bones, and the interesting thing is that these come out of those features that are the most recent, okay? That the ones that have trade goods in them, that have the defriant ceramics in them, and may very well be associated with that burial feature that we found, and maybe were used in ritual activities. No one's going to eat fox or lynx. So, very interesting. Okay. Now, who were the people who were probably living at New Lenox at the time when trade goods came into the area? Again, since there was great movement of people in the area, and since once trade goods come into the area, especially whole kettles and things like that, Native Americans stopped making pottery. So we don't have the link between prehistoric pottery and things that were made during the historic period. There are different thoughts by different archaeologists about who these people might have been. The Winnebago is one candidate, another the Illinois, but we think it was probably the Miami, probably based on the kinds of ceramics and by the locations of Miami sites on old historic maps. Now, the human remains that were found in that one grave were repatriated by the Miami, but by the Miami of Oklahoma, not by the Miami in Indiana, because the group in Oklahoma are the only federally recognized groups. Okay, so this is a recap of all of the work we did at New Lenox. These are all the areas that were stripped. These are all the features that were excavated. But as you can see, there's still a lot of work that could be done out there.
We've all learned a lot, and we look forward to learning a lot more about our prehistory. Thank you much.
Thank you. You're welcome.